welcome all of you to this panel discussion on scientific temper, its history, relevance, and evolving meaning. And we are greatly pleased to be able to do this for the National Scientific Temper Day. We dedicate this to the rationalist Narendra Dabholkar's memory. We have for this discussion four eminent panelists whom I will introduce in a minute. Following the introductions, each of the panelists will speak for about 5 minutes, addressing the first round of questions. After that, we will have a discussion on the views expressed by the panelists in the first round for about 10 minutes. This will be followed by concluding remarks by each panelist as I call them out. Let me introduce the panelists now. Ramaswamy taught at the Jawaharlal Nehru University from 1986 onwards in the School of Physical Sciences and the School of Computational and Integrative Sciences. Prior to coming to JNU, he was at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai. And after retiring in 2018, he was at the IIT Delhi. Presently, he holds the fellowship of the New India Foundation and has honorary positions at the IISER Berhampur and the University of Goa. He is at present working on a biography of D.D. Kosambi. He has authored two more volumes on D.D. Kosambi and edited several books, among them Meera Kosambi's A Fragmented Feminism, The Life and Letters of Anandibai Joshi, along with Madhavi Kolhatkar and Aban Mukherjee. Next, we have Prajval Shastri. She is an astrophysicist of over 4 decades. She investigates the physics of giant black holes that are found in the centers of distant galaxies using telescopes at multiple frequencies based on Earth as well as in space. She got her PhD from the TIFR, Mumbai. She was a faculty of the Indian Institute of Astrophysics, Bengaluru for 23 years. She has been a Fulbright Fellow at Stanford University and currently is an adjunct professor at the International Center for Radio Astronomy Research. She believes that the cultivation of scientific thinking is for everyone and works for the People's Science Movement. She is the founder and past chair of the Gender in Physics Working Group of the Indian Physics Association and much more. We have Archishman Raju, who is a scientist at the National Center for Biological Sciences, Bangalore. He did his PhD in physics at Cornell University. He works on the mathematical modeling of developmental biology. He was a part of the organizing committee of the Year of Gandhi in Philadelphia in 2019 and is associated with the Intercivilizational Dialogue Project and Gandhi Global Family. Last, we have Gita Chadha, who is a sociologist who has worked to develop the field of critical feminist science studies in India. Her research interests extend to questions of research methodology, visual cultures, and interdisciplinary pedagogies. She retired from the Department of Sociology of the University of Mumbai. Presently, she is a professor at the School of Arts and Sciences, Azim Premji University, an honorary senior fellow at the Archives NCBS. Geeta was the Obaid Siddiqui Chair for the year 2023-24 at the NCBS. This program is being recorded and helping us with the recording and the processing of this is Pavan Kumar, who is a faculty member at IISER Pune and who also has this very interesting podcast called Pratidhwani, which I invite you all to look at. I first invite Archishman to speak about the historical context of the term scientific temper. How has it evolved and its relevance today? Archishman, would you like to go on screen?
Yes, thank you, Shubashree. And it is very nice to be part of this discussion today, though I am, as you can see, the least eminent of our panelists.
There's
But
such
I just mean a joke. But I just wanted to, I guess, some of this was started by an article that I wrote, and maybe I'll just begin by summarizing some of the arguments that I wanted to make in that article. But I wanted to start off by saying that I personally am somebody who believes in science, of course, very broadly understood as a systematic approach to knowledge, and believes in the concept of truth. It's not a concept that's very popular nowadays, I have to say, but it is something that I think is worth defending and worth fighting for. Scientific temper, I think, is a term that gets used very often in our political discourse. I was just checking today morning for news with the term scientific temper, and I found several news articles. And it is routinely used, I think, in ways that don't properly define what we really mean by the idea of scientific temper. I think it has had a history in the Indian context. Some say India is the only constitution which has scientific temper as a concept in it. And of course, we've had several debates in our history, including famously in mainstream magazine with P.N. Huxer and Ashish Nandi and so on the concept of scientific temper. But I think if you look at most accounts of scientific temper, historically people will trace the concept back to our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. And I think, here I just want to say that, Nehru reportedly used to say that the biggest enemy of communism in India is the Communist Party of India. I don't know if he actually said that, but I have to say that sometimes I feel that the biggest enemy of Nehru in India is the Nehruvians of India. And the reason I say that is that I think we should not forget that was not some intellectual who was just talking or who was, some having an academic discussion. He was, I would consider him a revolutionary, somebody who spent more than 9 years, 10 years in jail fighting for our country's freedom, and somebody who knew the people of India and was very actively engaged in thinking about the future of our country and, of course, the future of our world. He, by some accounts, I think he's one of the most popular leaders to emerge out of the Afro-Asian world in his time. But regarding science, too often I think his ideas are confined to a few quotes from the discovery of India because he did a lot of his systematic writing, his books and so on, while he was in jail. After that, he didn't have time to write books. But we have a lot of letters, we have a lot of his speeches in the post-independence period. And I think that is something we must study more to understand Nehru as a thinker, as a philosopher, and particularly towards the end of his life. My feeling is, and I think others also feel, that he was trying to get closer and closer, trying to understand philosophically how to think about the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi in the context of a post-independent state. So, just briefly, I know I'll take a couple of more minutes to say that the few of the points that I think really Nehru brings up, if you look at his speeches on science, and he, gives several speeches on science afterwards in post-independent India in the 50s, in leading up to the early 60s. For him, I think science is something that carries a revolutionary spirit. He says it explicitly, to not be tied in by the old, but not be tied in by a social or economic fabric. But at the same time, for him, revolution in the Indian context is something that he thinks comes with continuities rather than breaks. And I think there's a very important interview that Rusi Karanjia, who used to edit this left-wing magazine Blitz, did with him in 1960, where he really, talks about the fact that he doesn't think he's made any break with Gandhi, even though a lot of leftists of that generation, including Rusi Karanjia, said that we think Gandhiji is unscientific and you are the more scientific version of. He doesn't. Nehru denies that, and in fact, Rusi Karanjia says this is very unlike the Jawaharlal of yesterday. It seems like you're searching for God in the evening of your life. And he again and again in towards the end of his life repeats Vinoba Bhave's formulation that the days of politics and religion are over. The future will be that of science and spirituality. And I think we have to try and understand what he meant by that. What two other short points I would like to make is that for Nehru, having seen the atomic bomb, he was not very, I think, optimistic about the endeavor of scientists. I mean, optimistic, maybe that's the wrong word, but he was critical of the endeavor of scientists. In many of his speeches, he says, well, there's tremendous progress, but there's also tremendous disaster. And he's some point he says we have arrived at the brink of hell. And so, he was quite critical of the way that scientists were participating in research to effectively just build weapons and effectively not really contribute to society in a way that he felt they should be. And finally, he had this idea that we have to fight for what he called the fully integrated human being with what he called a scientific spiritual approach. These are things we don't often associate with Jawaharlal Nehru, but I think you can very clearly see them, especially if you read him and his speeches at the end of his life. So I'll just stop there to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you for those very interesting remarks and about how Nehru really evolved, how the concept really evolved even in his time. Um, I would like to invite you, Ram, to speak now on is science, as D.D. Koshambi said, just the theology of the bourgeoisie? He said,
He didn't exactly say that. The
how
term
does the term
theology of the
scientific
bourgeoisie
temper
is,
translate?
well, so I mean, let me sort of come in
Yes,
and
sorry.
contextualize. I mean, what D.D. Kosambi said famously is that science is the cognition of necessity. But I'll come to that momentarily. I just wanted to take off from where Archishman was pointing out about Nehru's attitudes and in the later part of his life. But the one time when, and I tend to view things in the lens of Kosambi right now. So in 1947, actually, Nehru was the president of the Indian Science Congress. He was the main speaker there, starting a tradition that has gone on, that he would attend all the science congresses. And at that particular meeting, he sort of set out his manifesto for our country. He didn't talk about scientific temper itself. It was science in the service of the community. And what he said was that I'm just going to read from his speech. He was talking to making a case for globalizing Indian science. And this was just before independence in 1947. January is when the Science Congress was held, and independence was around the corner. So Nehru talked for globalizing Indian science, actually, and he had invited a whole bunch of visitors from abroad, including Harlow Shapley and a contingent from England, from the United States, Soviet Union, and so on. So he said, I'd like to assure the Science Congress and our friends who have come from abroad that we want to cooperate with science abroad in every way to advance the cause of peace in the world, peace and progress of humanity. But while giving that undertaking and pledge, I want to make it perfectly clear that we will not cooperate in the ways of war. This was just shortly after World War II. Later on, goes on to say, it is essential that New India should also come in intimate contact with the world of science. Because if science, whatever progress it may make, is isolated from the living currents, it will not go very far. If the new currents of Renaissance India go along the lines that are not of science, then they too will go into a blind alley, as we are seeing. Therefore, it becomes essential that the two must march together. See, the point is that, of course, he's quoted and whatnot for scientific temper, but for him, actually, science was the one way in which uh, we, the country could come out of years of colonial dominance. What the future will bring, I do not know. I can neither foretell the future nor have I any authority to bind my country down to what it may or may not do in the future. But I think it desirable and necessary that men and women of science should also think about the way in which they are often misused and exploited for base ends. And they should make it clear that they do not want to be so exploited. You cannot divorce science from social and political happenings in the economic structure of the world. Right. So what I want to underline is that for Nehru, science was the only way in which our country was going to progress out of the dark ages and so on. And that is why I think for a long time he was so supportive of of Bhabha and Sarabhai and so on, and others that were representative of Indian science. Now, Kosambi was there at the meeting. Okay, he was also part of this meeting, and I think that it had enough of an impact on him because he went on to write a very important essay. I mean, there were many reasons why he wrote this essay, but it's called Science and Freedom. And Science and Freedom was published in a Marxist journal, monthly review. In that, he says that freedom is the recognition of necessity, science is the cognition of necessity. The first is the classical Marxist definition of freedom, to which he says, I have added my own definition of science. Now, I think that, Kosambi was not the first to point out the connection between, the sort of important link between a certain kind of academic freedom and science. But he was certainly one who sort of wrote about it in a most eloquent manner. And for him, the necessity came from society. There is, he talks about the social structure that gives rise to needs and necessities, and therefore it sort of inspires science. And again, for him, it goes on that science is incremental, and it knows only one test, and that is of validity. So even before actually, so this was it was a very inventive way of defining science as being born out of social needs, which is very characteristic of Kosambi, because for him everything was class analysis. Uh, so he goes on in that particular article to say that science is the history of science. So everything that comes up, it adds up to to the whole thing. Now, Shubha said, how does this term translate in the world of science, the theology of the bourgeoisie? It's actually not the theology. In this article, he doesn't call it the theology of the bourgeoisie. I should actually try to get let me see if I have a copy of it easily available. Right. What he says actually is modern science is the creation of the bourgeoisie, not the theology itself. Now, the reason for this is, I'll just take a few more minutes just to explain, because this is actually a largely unknown essay by Kosambi on C.V. Raman. He wrote a really strong article against Raman and Raman's way of doing science. And in that, he also criticized Homi Bhabha, Vikram Sarabhai, and so on. And he sees the emergence of science in India as as done by a bunch of people who were somehow sucking up to the powers that be. So in this article, it's too long to read too much out of, but he says that the scientists have been keeping on good terms with the newly powerful nationalists in the years immediately after independence. The same, but he's also very critical of the attitude of scientists, and he says that the same facile character which enables them to please government officials helps them placate anyone in power, and then they claim to put India upon the map of world science. One Indian professor belonged to the class that looks forward. So he was talking about the change in class character post-independence. Only one of them, that is Bhabha, was born to share capital, which paid for his education and gave him the capitalist friends who created an institute for him. So the fact that the Tatars gave the money to Bhabha for TIFR, there he says that it's only the class analysis of that incident. The rest have become shareholders on a considerable scale merely because of the rapid capitalist expansion of India during World War II. Then he goes on to criticize Sarabhai. He says the least practical found his wildcat schemes turn into gold mines, and so on and so forth. The sort of the underlying tone of Kosambi is that all of science, and particularly the science that India does, is an importation. It's got nothing to do with Indian ideas. And he goes on to conclude this essay with the following sentence. He says, the same class for which modern science was a necessity has assimilated the top scientists. Neither the science, nor for that matter, the idea of capitalist production are in any way Indian. Right? So for Kosambi, his, I mean, perhaps very severe criticism of the methods of science and so on, but to him it is it is linked in a sense to big business. Only those who can afford to fund science, they are the ones who will direct it. And his article on science and freedom is really a call to be aware of this intimate connection. Okay, so let me stop here.
Thank you so much. That kind of seamlessly takes us to the next, to the complementary perspective. Prajwal, can you talk briefly about the people science movement and also give a perspective from the people science movement on this issue that we're talking about today? Do you see a conflict there with what Ram just said?
Okay, I just had a little bit of a sparking here on my desk, so I don't know if it is serious. Right now, I still seem to be connected, right? You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I should be okay. Yeah, so I don't really see a contradiction with anything that either Archishman or Ram have said, but there is sort of in the public discourse, perhaps some confusion and conflation of what the people science movement is about. So let me say firstly that I'm really, really glad this is happening, and thanks a lot for inviting me, because getting the idea of this National Scientific Temper Day into the public discourse was indeed one of our goals when we decided in 2016 in the People Science Movement to observe the 20th of August as National Scientific Temper Day. And why did we think it was necessary, especially when we already have a National Science Day on the 20th of February? Primarily because National Science Day has become a sort of an occasion to merely showcase the accomplishments of science, and institutions have open days, etc. And it's very little about the processes of science or the scientific method, and it's become more about successes, very little about failures. I mean, we as scientists wouldn't really call them failures, but it has become that way. And it's certainly not about scientific thinking or scientific thinking for everybody. So while the Indian people science movement has always championed scientific thinking for everybody, scientific temper in the movement is quite distinctively defined, and also perforce in both its structure and its praxis rejects gatekeeperism and the exclusionary ethos of scientific institutions. So firstly, I would say it is all rooted in context, the socio-political, cultural context. For example, the nexus between political power and religious institutions. Not institutions and not religion, just religious institutions. Secondly, we naturally and perforce find common ground with the teachings of, for example, Gautama Buddha, or something that I, as a Kannadiga, am more familiar with, namely the Karnataka Vachana movement of the 12th century. So therefore, there's no question of confusing this definition with the so-called Western notion of the rationalist movement, especially a rationalist movement cast as an atheist movement. So the 12th century Vachana movement of Karnataka, for example, was one where religious insights, by which I mean insights into one's relationship with the self and one's place in the universe, was seen as based on experience and not on revealed truth. Thirdly, there are very few scientists, meaning salaried scientists, who are associated with the people's science movement. In fact, unlike with the previous generation of scientists and academics in general, I see a further regression, I would say. Taking Bengaluru as an example, and those of the previous generation that played a role in sort of crafting Bengaluru as a science city, etc. In recent years, there has been a regression. And as a salaried scientist, I have certainly faced and seen, at best, disparaging comments, and at worst, something else. And not coincidentally, Bengaluru has now become an IT city rather than a science city. And finally, the people science movement fights the outcomes. So India is the only country in the world where respectable institutions of higher education started PhDs in astrology, for example. And I remember being a scientist at the Indian Institute of Astrophysics. We all wrote collective petitions against this and so on, but it was a very small minority of scientists who actually did that. And our word did not prevail, of course. And I think India is the only country where today citizens who hold the highest educational degrees, such as PhDs, and work in the most elitist institutions, such as the Indian Institute of Science, still cling to what one would have thought would be long, long discarded superstitious beliefs, even about things like eclipses. So for us, it is very much the Nehruvian definition that conclusions must be based on evidence, and therefore there needs to be a willingness to change our conclusions based on the evidence. So there is a rejection of revealed truth. So the people science movement fights against exploitation and causing physical and mental harm in the name of religion, and not against religion itself. And this was roughly also Narendra Dabolkar's position, and I would concur with his position that caste-based discrimination, for example, is also unscientific. Indeed, gender-based discrimination is also unscientific, and so forth. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Prajwal, for bringing up particularly the point that there's this need to come to terms with oneself, where religion plays a role, and there's this the understanding the world where science and it's almost like reconciling the quantum and
Classical
you know
points.
not just the classic, I mean the relativity and the quantum mechanics, trying to bring them together. It's almost as difficult. Anyway, now we'll move
Yeah,
on.
but that was not my statement.
That is not your
I mean,
statement.
full disclosure, I'm an atheist,
Okay.
and it is not my, yeah, that was not my statement. Yeah.
Yeah, but even if you're there are atheist schools that still have, like the Charvaka faith and things like that, right? So even there is the sense of, I mean, it's not, yeah. So let me just not waste time. Let me move on to the next speaker. Geeta, from the point of view of the sociologist, well, how would you approach? Can you critique this whole understanding of scientific temper from the scientist's point of view, from a sociologist's point of view?
So, hi, thank you, Shubha. And I'm glad we are having this conversation around the National Scientific Temper Day. And I am the odd one out, and I feel like that because a sociologist among scientists, and particularly somebody who's working in critical science and technology studies, it's not a very easy place to be in. Uh, Also, because, so I do feel like the odd one out, but I think there is a shared commitment to a certain kind of vision of society for India that we are looking at, and that is probably what brings us together. Um, I, as some of you would know, have been very critical in a way, being involved in the, every time social scientists or take a critical approach to science in society, there is a backlash. There is a backlash both from scientists, but interestingly, from the orthodox left. And this we saw in one, the statement that Archishman referred to, the controversy that happened between on mainstream between Ashish Nandi, who was talking about the need for a humanistic temper, very similar to what we've heard today, and the others, P.N. Huxer and others, who spoke about a scientific temper in the more, I would say, more identifiable and conventional terms that Indian modernity knew. Then there was the major controversy around Alan Sokal's hoax, which some of us got embroiled in. Again, the wars, science wars, got fought on some very interesting axes about the polarization, for example, between natural sciences and social sciences, on the polarization, for example, between the left and everything else which was not left, which then became the right, polarization on science and anti-science. Having been involved deeply in some of those very polemical debates, my own work took me in very different directions to actually look at my own discipline. So we, as sociologists, introduce our discipline often as a science, systematic study of society and the science of society. So what was that dream when sociology actually began as a discipline? It was modeled and derived on the basis of the physical natural sciences, which were also deriving their methodological discourse. Whatever they did in the laboratories would be different, but the methodological discourse philosophically that came from, Popperian idea and all of that. So there was a dream in the birth of sociology that we will become as exact, as quantifiable. We will produce knowledge about society, which is can be used for social engineering, for prediction. But the important thing was that this dream at that time also was contested by questions and challenges. This positivist dream of wanting to produce a social physics, so to speak, thinking about the laws of social and cultural and civilizational spaces as much as we can think of laws of evolution of nature. Yeah, that position was already contested with the interpretivist argument, which argued saying that no, social reality, human cultures are far more complex and therefore require a very different kind of method that we need to use to understand, not just explain, but deeply understand human societies and social things. That debate is a very interesting one between positivism and interpretivism, which also actually posits two different kind of ontologies and epistemologies, which is to say that human societies, human beings are far more meaning-making creatures. Meaning is subjective. Subjectivity comes out of personal context, but it also comes out of cultural context. And therefore, the kind of scientific method we need to evolve to understand human beings, human cultures, and human societies has to be based on the principle of empathy, has to be based on the principle of understanding rather than mere observation. Anyway, this is just the context in which the discipline evolved. But the dream of the discipline was to be scientific. I personally think that sociology itself is an expression of scientific temper, which is to use scientific method to understand things outside of the, natural, physical, organic universe. right? So in that sense, the sociology as a discipline itself was an expression of, I would say, scientific temper. But the way sociology looked at science, it's very interesting that the sociology of science as a subdiscipline till the 60s, till the work of Thomas Kuhn, actually was largely used in the service of science, right? That it was all about how science is the model for truth and progress. And therefore, sociology as a discipline should do everything to propel that ahead. But it's the 60s in the post war period with Thomas Kuhn and his structure of scientific revolution, the kind of work that he did to indicate that it's not just the Popperian model at work, but in establishing scientific knowledge, but there are other social things within the scientific community that actually lead to how truth gets established. And I agree with Archishman that it's very important to hold on to the idea of truth even today. But it's important also to nuance it and to complicate it by understanding that there is probably not one single or absolute or universal truth. Anyway, so what that kind of sociology of science, and then we also looked at social science from the perspective of sociology of knowledge, right? And there it was very interesting how things were shaping up. Because in the early birth of sociology of knowledge, science was given a clear check. Now, let me explain this. All other systems of beliefs and knowledge, we sought as a discipline to look for social determinants of these, whether it was religion, whether it is politics, whether it is, magic for that matter. What are the social components and determinants and facts that lead to these beliefs? But science was given a separate chit, a privilege, that science will not fall into this category because science is asocial, ahistorical, apolitical, right? Now that shifted in the 70s. Thomas Kuhn happened in the 60s. In the 70s, the shift happened in sociology of knowledge by scholars like David Bloor, who came up with this idea or saying that if we do not examine science on the same terms as we examine religion or politics, then we are committing disciplinary harakiri. Okay? That as a discipline, we need to look at science on par with other systems of belief or systems of truth. Yeah. So he posited, so when we are talking about what is science, in the Bloorian idea of the strong program, science is distinguished by the fact that it looks at causality, it uses impartiality, it uses symmetry, and it uses reflexivity. The first two are probably clear, but the second two meant that we need to examine science symmetrically, as we do examine politics and religion and other things. Yeah. And reflexivity meant that we need to look at ourselves using the same lens. Right? So if I were to use the scientific method or the scientific temper, the way roughly all of us understand it, upon science, and that is where the kind of work that we've been doing, saying, let us use, and today I think my time is up.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
just quickly. So what I'm saying is that those of us who critiqued a certain kind of model of development, a certain kind of scientism that had seeped into our society, and we sort of critiqued a Nehruvian paradigm in, say, the late 90s. I think there is a need for us to look, as Archishman has just done, look more deeply into that idea and to reclaim and recover and retrieve things that we have lost about what does it mean to be actually committed to science or to the spirit of science. And I'll just end by saying that from the work that we've been doing, I'd say that we need to look at both the nature of science more scientifically and the culture of science more scientifically, so that we can fulfill, I would say, the moral project that that science holds within it. I would say, of course, it's not a project that is exclusionarily available only to science. I would say it's available as much to religion, as much to politics, as much to cinema, So it's these kind of linkages that perhaps we need to reclaim, retrieve from the narratives that we have, so that we sort of bring in science back as a moral project and not just as a fallow project of producing, universal, absolute, general truth. Yeah. Sorry, Shubha, I took a little more time than I should
Thank you.
have.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you very much.
I,
And I think Ram has to go. So, would you like to give some comments on the conversation that's been happening before you leave?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Shubha. And I apologize. I had already told Shubha my boundary conditions for today. Uh, See, the thing is that, of course, what Gita has talked about is very general, and the people science movement is something that I've actually participated in, thanks to Prajval recently as well. See, there is a difference between the practice of science as it is done in our country and the aims and ambitions, let's say, of the founders of our country, Gandhi, Nehru, and so on. And I thought that we should really be focusing a little on that aspect of it. Has science or has the over-reliance of Nehru and scientific temper, or on science as a vehicle for the upliftment of people, um, has it been realized, and is it in danger of being lost right now? Because I mean, we are living in a climate where the methods of science are used, and the advances, in modern India is impossible without science and technology, and yet there's a fundamental lack of belief in its methods. In whichever way in which you can corrupt the methods of science, it's done. And I don't want to get into giving examples of how and where things are. I mean, this is sort of a parody of populism. You can not only just falsify the science, but you can also falsify the results, and that we are seeing that in so many different aspects. I think we should focus a little on how it applies to our context, because that is where the danger really is in our country, that we are somewhere losing touch with using science in a sort of in the way in which, let's say, at least those architects of freedom were thinking about it. Uh, I am really sorry I have to go, but I do. And I mean, this is a conversation which hopefully will not stop soon. And I'm very pleased for another reason, and that is to see that Confluence and Dialogue are are moving into this dimension. And it's sort of satisfying to see that happen. Okay. Okay, to my fellow panelists, I'm sorry. I will look forward to engaging with you all in person at some point in time.
That will be
Cheers.
lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking
Bye.
your time. Yeah,
Yeah.
bye. So, would anyone else like to take up the baton now? Achishman, would you like to say something?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Professor Ramaswamy left. A couple of things I wanted to say to what he. One is just a question of Kosambi, and the question of, in the same essay that he was referring to. I don't know what the monthly review version had, but if you look at the one that was published in his collection of essays, Exasperating Essays, published by People's Publishing House, with the same title, Science and Freedom, that has the statement, Science is the Theology of the Bourgeoisie, a few paragraphs down from what he was quoting. So there's a direct quote from Kosambi, just, on that question. And I think what he was saying about science, Kosambi's famous statements about science is the cognition of necessity, and freedom is the recognition of necessity. I don't think he's talking about academic freedom. I think he's talking about human freedom. And, he's building, of course, on Engels. Engels is kind of explaining this Hegelian idea, freedom is the recognition of necessity, kind of seeing how necessity, which seems to be the opposite of freedom, is so much into the concept of freedom itself. But I think what Kosambi is trying to say is, and that's why science and freedom, he's trying to say that science can be in the service of human freedom. And that's, I think, that's an idea that we have to pursue. That's an idea that's important. And in some ways, at least the way I read Kosambi, he's saying things that are very similar to Nehru. I mean, obviously they didn't agree on everything, but on this question of war and nuclear war, I think Kosambi and Nehru are, have very similar positions. Kosambi, of course, is a part of the World Peace Council. He represents several peace delegations, leads several peace delegations from India to various places in the world. And I think that's something that we have to talk about because, I mean, and I don't mean to, but I have, just discursively, I want to say, and also to his last point, I mean, if people want to politically and ideologically fight the BJP, they should do that. But we can't confine the discourse on science to just that question. I mean, put your ideas to the people about why go ahead. I mean, that's something that we should do. I mean, whoever wants to do that, that's something they should do. But we're dealing with questions here of, I really think, of human existence. I mean, nuclear war is a question of human existence. We can't treat it lightly. And I don't think we are any further away from the prospect of nuclear war, from the prospect of world wars today than we were back then. I mean, most people are talking about this moment as, a second Cold War. And so, I think India as an Asian nation that is going to be probably one of the biggest economies, alongside China in 25 years, is going to have to play a role in the world. And we have to deal with these ideas, and cannot just confine them to, immediate, because we talk about ideas that are relevant to humanity's future. And I think we have to treat them with a certain seriousness, and not every discussion can be about, and that's, I mean, that's just my opinion. On the question of, Europe, and where Europe enters into this, I mean, I think we have to see, and maybe Geeta was bringing some of these questions up. I mean, let's say rationalism. The rationalist movement in Europe, if you read the European philosophers, I mean, Descartes, he's trying to prove the existence of God. He is the rationalist, and so I mean, let's be clear on what we mean by European rationalism. And the reason I bring up European philosophy is because I don't think we can at the same time hold the position that modern science is the creation of Europe and that European philosophy is not something we have to deal with, but we can just, talk about philosophy independent of Europe. I think we have to be able to deal with what we make of European philosophy. And the fact of the matter, I think, is that a lot of the ways that we talk about science today, I think, is closer really to positivism than it is to rationalism. And that is a philosophical movement. I don't think it's that hard to understand. I think we can understand, and I think we have to go beyond it. And my contention is that in examining the ideas of people like Nehru and Gandhi, if we take them seriously as thinkers, they are moving beyond the European philosophical moment. I mean, they are, and I can, it's a longer discussion, but they are moving beyond this idea that the entirety of human experience can be explained by European philosophy. And they're moving beyond it in very new and creative ways. And we have to I think that's something we have to study more. And then finally, I will say, and so for example, a lot of people say, well, Indian society doesn't have scientific temper. Well, which society has scientific temper? I mean, Germany, I mean, is it the country that produced Hitler? That's what scientific temper gives you? I mean, at least we produce Gandhi. Let's not undersell what our people have done in the freedom struggle. That's what I would like to put on the table. And then finally, I would say that I agree that if we are talking about scientific temper going outside of the natural sciences, and that's how Nehru meant it, scientific temper to understand society, then we really have to ask whether the whether we need a new philosophy, whether this idea that reason and evidence is enough um, to understand society. And I think will the same, I don't think the same methods apply. The methods of natural sciences, I don't think will apply to a study of society. And so we have to deal really with modes of thinking, different modes of thinking. And that's something that is particularly important today because the Western liberal democratic order is in crisis. Everywhere you see, it is a world order that is in crisis. And so, what are the new ways of thinking which will allow us to move forward in a peaceful manner, in a creative manner, and a humanistic manner?
I just have a couple of comments to make on that. That was a very rich set of remarks that you've raised, Archishman. But one thing you did mention that we have produced a Gandhi, but the Germans have managed to move beyond Hitler, but we still haven't managed to move beyond the caste system, right? Despite Gandhi and despite all the science that the modernism that's happened to India.
Well, have they? I question that. But anyway, that's a longer discussion. So
That's
maybe
a
I'll
long
let the other
discussion.
people.
This discussion has who would like to speak next, Prajwal or Geeta? Geeta, maybe you could comment on Archishman's
Uh,
positivism and
yeah, no, I mean, Ram left at a point where he said, let's not talk general, let's talk about the specific problem that is on hand. And my question is, why are we here? Yeah, why are we at this point? Yeah, if the kind of model that we extracted or abstracted out of the early nation builders, whether it's Nehru, Gandhi, Ambedkar, yeah, if we had extracted out the full whole principles and the vision, we would not be where we are today, right? Whether it is, and I'd say this very categorically, that both the left and the scientific community in the question of science have failed us quite remarkably. The scientific community's failure, we've all talked about. Yeah. Now, the point is, when it comes to the understanding of science in India, there is the liberal approach that you have, the liberal socialist approach that you have in Nehru, and Gandhi, perhaps, to some extent, despite his damning critique of industrialization and, in a way, science technology also of a certain kind. You also have the Marxist view, very similar. The only difference is that the Marxist view will bring in capitalism and say that yes, science played in the hands of capitalism, and we have to break that connection and talk about science that comes from the people, and or make the scientific community much less bourgeoisie, much less elite, and we will have the solution. You have the decolonializing impulse that comes later with people like Ashish Nandi, who try to tell you further that neither of these models have actually going to survive, because the science is not only just a tool in the hand of the capitalists as we are seeing it, we have to extract it out of there, but it's also become the raison of state, the raison d'etre for the nation states everywhere, right? And this nexus between the nation state, the market, and science is something which we need to examine very carefully, because that's how science becomes a source of deep violence and hegemony. In their book, they talk about it. Yeah. Now, where do, for example, we take this entire thing ahead? I would say that the new way of thinking that Archishman is talking about possibly requires some sort of a synthesis now, a greater synthesis of these approaches in order to actually serve the purpose of what we are talking about, the moral project of science. And this cannot be done unless the left looks at itself critically, unless the liberals look at ourselves, themselves and ourselves critically, or the colonial theorists, because even Science, Hegemony as Violence is a book that was produced as a response to an over-liberal, over-left perspective, where it failed dramatically on the question of caste. you have a little bit of engagement on the question of gender, but there is no engagement on the question of caste. So when they're talking about alternatives to science, they're only talking about upper caste alternatives of Vedic non-dualism and this and that. We need to go deeper, and we need to dig out from Ambedkar. We need to dig out from the anti-caste movements. What is the sense of rationalism or science, but also what is the sense of morality that comes from there? I just want to submit this much, that we need a much deeper integration of religion, politics, and science for us to actually deliver the project of the moral project of justice, equality, whether it's on the question of caste, whether it's on the question of gender, whether it's on the question of indigeneity, whether, look at the scientific community, we all agree it's highly gated. Yeah, how about we start looking at that ourselves from within? Use the same scientific method, same scientific terms, same critical thinking, same reasoning to say, what are we doing? One is at that level, and the other is to finally actually look at science as one. For me, as a sociologist, science, scientific temper, is one critical tool in the project of reimagination of society or the world on more moral terms. We need to look at spirituality. We need to look at religion. We need to look at philosophy, as Archishman has been saying. We need to look at politics. I mean, this whole battle is not going to be won only through science. And therefore, I think it's important for us to bring science and scientists in conversation with, I don't know, politics, religion, artists, so that we can work towards a different sort of an imagination. I have taken too long of your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Geeta, for saying that. It is also the name of the journal to which Confluence belongs. Dialogue is Dialogue, Science, Society, and Scientists. So it has been mooted with the intention of bringing about this conversation.
Question, Shubha, sorry, if I may say, question is, yes, the dialogue, but towards what? Right? We also need to, so that's why I bring about Bloor again, towards reflexivity, towards asking ourselves very difficult questions about what we hold as true and sacred to us. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Prajwal, can you give me your concluding remarks, please?
I don't know if I qualify to give concluding remarks. I'll say something in response. So, I mean,
your response to the conversation till now. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, given that this was about National Scientific Temper Day and the idea of and the idea of scientific temper, and that National Scientific Temper Day came about from the People Science movement, I wanted to say that it is, I think, really important not to conflate what happens within the practice of science in scientific institutions and the idea of scientific temper. And the people science movement. They're different. Their imaginings are different. So in my own experience as a practicing scientist, salaried scientist, my experience is that within the scientific community, there was not a discontent with the status quo. This is in some sense different, I think, from the previous generation. A lot of the previous generation of scientists, a lot of the women scientists in particular, I would say, but maybe not necessarily, were inspired by the freedom struggle, the ethos of what it meant to fight imperialism, to decolonize, and all of those ideas. Those ideas are not something that I experienced in my generation of science practice. So in my generation of science practice, it was very much a comfort with the status quo. It was not about seeing either science or our practice as scientists or our sort of practice as citizens having anything to do with societal transformation. And that is where the people science movement is different, because the people science movement is founded on the idea of social transformation. And so scientific temper just becomes a sort of natural part of the ethos. And the idea, the whole outcome we have today of Indian science practice being not only insular and away from the idea of social transformation, but also very much, upper caste dominated, gender inequitable, and so on and so forth. These are all, symptoms of this dichotomy, symptoms of how the Indian scientific institution as a whole has become a gatekeeping, exclusionary kind of institution. And one of the things I certainly experienced is that when that institution constructs itself and grows, it certainly does not see commitment to the scientific method as a prerequisite. So no hiring process or promotion process or anything requires one as a scientist to be committed to the scientific method. So people use this. So this is just one example of how the science practice in scientific institutions is very different from the people science movement and the idea of championing scientific temper and scientific thinking for everybody and all of that.
Thank you. Archishman?
And I should add that while I agreed with virtually everything that Gita said about how the left movement needs to be reflective, etc., I don't see what that has got to do with the practice of science per se, because the practice of science has to independently be reflective. The problem there is not that practicing scientists are all leftists, far from it. It is that practicing scientists do not see themselves as agents of social transformation, either within science or outside of it as citizens. They very much it's become like they very much want to be wedded to the status quo and questioning the status quo, imagining a different kind of society, science practice. These are seen as sort of rocking the boat and undesirable, if anything. They are not reinforced by the current structures of science.
Yeah, if I may, Shubha, I absolutely sort of concur with Prajval on many of the things that she has said. And I think, in fact, she's been one of the most important figures who's leading, for example, within science, a whole rethinking about how deeply patriarchal scientific institutions are. I think my only probably different starting point, if I may say, is that the way I look at scientific method or scientific temper or questions of science in society probably are from a slightly wider experience, which is that as sociologists, if I begin to criticize or critique or challenge the supremacy and the hegemony of science and scientific method and scientific temper, however it may be defined, the scientific community, of course, is the backlash comes from there. The reason I bring the left is because the backlash has also come from there. Because the left also tends to a certain kind of orthodox left also, and as feminists, we know that that becomes very difficult. It becomes it's again reproducing a certain very a narrow understanding of science and scientific temper and or let's say even if it has a wider concept, its response is that the moment you critique science, you are actually anti-progress, anti-development, anti modernity, almost. So that is where I think I'm coming from, by bringing in that even movements based on a very left-based understanding, materialism, understanding of Indian society, which is what we need to probably in many ways. We need to sort of examine our understanding and expand our understanding of what is science, and what is the scientific method and what scientific temper. That's the only submission that I'm saying, that on a new imagination, we need the left also to examine itself more closely, as we need also the colonial critiques of the 90s, who sort of said that, who were dubbed as postmodernist. Yeah. So I think we need a sort of a gestalt overall. I mean, I know it's easier said than done, but I think if we don't even start imagining it, then I think we have nowhere to go.
Well, that's a lot to think about and chew, uh, and for later consumption. Archishman, would you like to say anything else on what Geeta and Prajwal have been saying?
Yeah, I guess I could just make one final um, set of comments, and I think it's always interesting to me that if you look at our and I don't mean this personally at all, but I just mean this more as a sociological thing, that if you look at our left liberal intelligentsia, I mean, everywhere you see there's pessimism about the country, there's pessimism about the future of the nation, and in pretty much every survey, and you can ask whether what these surveys are achieving, but in any case, whatever data exists, Indians as a whole are some of the most optimistic people in the world. Now you can question the survey, but my point being just this, that I think it is true that the left liberal intelligentsia has lost the Indian people, has lost the support of the Indian people. And at one point, I think we had intellectuals who were closely connected to the people. I was just recently seeing these videos. This year is the centenary of the um, of the Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba. And I was just recently seeing these videos when he was assassinated in 1961. You had thousands of people come out to protest his assassination in New Delhi and other places. And so here you have a set of, uh, people who've reached a new stage, really, I think, with our freedom struggle. Um, and I don't, I have to say, I mean, I think I am optimistic. I think we have to be optimistic about the future of our people. And I think, the question is, and this is the question that I think bothered Nehru at the end of his life. He was not bothered about, well, scientific and technological progress, will our country catch up or not? He thought that would happen one way or the other. For him, the question was the question of the human being. Question of the human being in a modern society. How will we reach almost a new stage of humanity, which can deal with this complex world, which can deal with this really world which is going further and further towards violence, I think, unfortunately. And that's the way I think in which he was using this term, scientific temper. And so, in that sense, I agree. We have to talk about a new kind of science, a new kind of epistemology. We have to discuss these ideas more openly, and we have to have, it can't just be that we all take for granted that we mean the same thing when we say scientific thinking. We have to have an open discussion on this. And my last point is that I think we can't do that unless we properly see the leaders of our freedom struggle as thinkers and philosophers in their own right, and as setting the foundation for what I think can still lead us into the future.
Thank you. Very thought-provoking points and from all of you. And I hope we'll continue to have discussions like this in future. I'd like to thank each one of you personally for making it to this panel discussion. Thanks to Confluence and Dialogue and Indian Academy of Sciences for hosting this platform. And thanks to Pawan for helping us put this together. So thank you very much, everyone.